So let me do a very quick recap of some of the major things that we started with. First of all, there's more to you than what you've imagined. Seeing that God's mind is full of you, surely we've got to realize that maybe there's stuff about me that I have not discovered yet. Maybe there's something more to me than the self I've been aware of. And indeed there is. And so we started looking at two aspects of what makes you you. The first aspect is the very mimetic nature of you. Now when I say mimesis or mimetic, is just it's the scientific word they use for our reflective capability. It's where we get imitate or mimic or those things from. Mimesis is the process by which we reflect others, by which we enter into relationship with others. So those two aspects, the first fact that you are mimetic by nature, you are a being that reflect, and the second aspect we looked at is the enormous formative qualities of desire. That desires is what drives you, intentions is what moves you. And so when you combine those two together and you realize that your desires are mimetic, I don't know if we have fully realized the implications of that, because we are so used to trying to protect the me that we thought we are, and that me wants to be the originator and the possessor of its own desires. That me doesn't need anybody else to be me. And what this is starting to tell you is that you are intimately and inseparably bound to others, and there is more otherness to what makes you you than what you are aware of. In other words, you cannot be you by yourself. You cannot be fully yourself by yourself. There's something relational about humanity that means that there's always another in what makes yourself yourself. And I want to discover what that other is. And so for the process of that, a different way in which we've termed it is there needs to be both otherness and likeness. Now, otherness can be a bit scary, because otherness normally refers to something that's unknown. And we put protective walls up against otherness, people who are not like us, cultures that's not like us, things that's not like us. Otherness is a bit scary because it might harm you, because you don't fully know what is other. But otherness can also be quite exciting. You know, and so we want enough otherness to excite us, but not too much otherness to scare us. We just want the right balance. And likeness as well. Likeness can be quite scary, because if something or someone's too much like you, they might replace you. And so when all differentiation disappears, that can be scary as well, because you become unnecessary. And so we want enough likeness for relationship to form, because there can't be relationship without likeness. But we don't want too much likeness to lose ourselves. And both of those, I'm going to show you how they come into such a beautiful harmony and balance as we recognize both likeness and otherness in the God who imagined you. And there's something quite other about you. something about you that you might not have discovered yet. So I want to look at the Genesis text quickly to show how God starts the process of creation by bringing order to chaos. I like what Professor Christine Haynes from the Yale University says on some of her lectures. We've often used this text to refer to the ultimate origins of the universe, but she shows how a better rendering of that first line would be when God began creating. Now there was chaos on the face of the earth, and he breathed and his spirit upon it, and he starts creating differences. So on the first day he creates the difference between light and darkness. See, this is all the process of bringing order into this chaos. So the first difference he creates is the difference between light and darkness. On the second day, he creates the difference between the waters above, the waters below. In ancient cosmology, there was water everywhere, above us, beneath us, all around us. And it's the water of chaos, often symbolized by chaos monster. Leviathan is one of the typical monsters of chaos that lives in the waters that we also read about in the scriptures. And this cosmology kind of developed because, as all ancient cosmology, Israel had the same ancient cosmology. They weren't scientifically perfect in their view of the world. They also saw a big blue sky, and for them it meant there was a lot of water up there. There's an ocean up there. And so on the second day he separates the water above from the waters below. On the third day he separates the dry land from the water. And then in day 4, 5 and 6 he is now going to fill the spaces that he created on day 1, 2 and 3. So on day 1, he created the difference between light and darkness. On day 4, he fills these two spaces by creating the sun to rule by day and the moon and the lesser lights to rule by night. On day 5, he fills the spaces that he created on day 2. And he puts the fowl in there and he puts the creatures in the sea. Now, what's beautiful for me is that the way in which God creates is very cooperative. He doesn't just make stuff, makes fish and throw them in the ocean. No, God speaks to the substance from which he wants to make the new things he wants to make. And he invites his creation to be part of the creative process. So when he wants to make the fish of the sea, he speaks to the sea. And he says, "See, you bring forth creatures." Can you see that God's much more cooperative in the way in which he involves his whole creation? Why? Because God's the one vibrating in every atom, keeping together every molecule of water. The fact that creation is involved in the process of creating doesn't mean that God is not involved. It means that he is very much involved. So he brings forth the fish, the creatures of the sky. And on day 6, he creates the animals, the plants, and humans to fill the space of the earth that he created. And it's so beautiful that he says every creature brought forth according to its own species. That word species from the Latin speculum is the Latin word, which it's interesting. It's the same word for mirror. You see, a species is a group of creatures that more accurately reflects one another than another species. And so the last work of creation is where he creates something in a completely different species. He creates a being that would reflect him. And just as God spoke to the substance from which he wanted to create fish, the ocean, when God wants to create you, he speaks to the substance from which you are created, and he speaks to himself. And he says, let us bring forth man. Ocean, bring forth fish. Earth, bring forth creatures. Let us bring forth man, our image, our likeness. So here we've got everything that's necessary for mimesis to take place, for reflection to take place. We've got otherness and we've got likeness. We've got, the whole scene is set. What is going to spark? What is going to start? What is going to animate mankind? If we believe the psychological analysis, there's one thing that animates human beings, and that's desire. What desire is going to breathe life into man? And we read in verse 28, and God baraked. That word barak, which we translated blessed, it's got the root word kneel, and it's most often used when somebody wanted to bring gifts to another. They would kneel and bring gifts. If you go and look at the Strong's definition, it says an act of adoration such as kneeling. This is what God does to man. Man's first conscious experience, which I believe is part of a creative experience that forms us, is the experience in which we witness the adoration of our Maker. And man is adored not because of anything he achieved, not because of anything. You don't adore your newborn baby because of some behavior. You just adore them because they're from you. And so God adores man. And this begins the process of reflection. Because we love, why? Because he first loved us. We desire, why? Because he first desired us. See, this is why you don't give God any adoration or worship or glory by saying how stupid, undeserving, and worthless you are. You don't bring a father any honor by telling him how worthless his children are. Good. The only way in which you can accurately adore God is to acknowledge and reflect the adoration he gives you. This is why James 3 says a spring cannot give bitter and sweet water. And how can you, with this mouth, worship God and curse a man made in his image and likeness? In other words, the most accurate measure of your worship is not the beautiful things you say about God. The most accurate measure of your worship is what you say about man. Good. This is why in 1 John says, hey, don't come with me with your beautiful stories of how you love God, but you're just so irritated with people. He says, don't tell me those stories because people are the visible image and likeness of God. And so if you want to love God, it's very simple. Love people. Yeah, as you love yourself. That's so beautiful. That's right. 1 John 1:7. If you walk in the light, as He is in the light. In other words, before that He said, some people, they continue to walk in darkness, but their confession is, I'm in the light. He says, no. You see, there's only one way to know that you are enlightened. And that is not by how many scriptures you can quote. It's not by how eloquently you can argue your point of view. It's not by the logic you use to explain your position. The only way in which you know that you are enlightened is this. You will enjoy, have fellowship, intertwine with your brethren. You will love people. It's so simple. If truth is not justified by words, it's justified by love. Truth has found a language. Read it in Ephesians. Truth speaks love. Love is the language of truth. And so, when you start seeing a God who adores you, you cannot but start wondering, what is it that He sees that makes Him desire me? See, this is the perfect, the ideal place of mimesis, where we behold the adoration of God and we reflect it back. Now can you see that in this place of reflective relationship, there's no competition. There's no rivalry. God is not nervous that He will be replaced, or that you are going to enter into competition with Him. Because you see, the level of equality determines the level of intimacy. Fellowship and equality has got the same base meaning. To have fellowship with somebody means to share things in common. To be equal to someone is to share all things in common. And so God's not nervous of making a creature in His image and likeness. Why not? Because God's purpose for this equality is intimacy. And in intimacy there's no competition. But now we're going to go and look at how desire can be adjusted and slightly twisted. And the very quality that makes us most like God can also make us worse than animals. And I want to go through that little path as well to understand our own makeup. And for me, it's so beautiful to look at the stories in Genesis. It's not easy to see it in the English Bible, but in the Hebrew it becomes quite obvious, and scholars have told us for a long time that there were at least two sources from which the Pentateuch was constructed, and they divided into Elohim and the Yahwist source. This is why you find a repetition of just about every story in the Old Testament. You've got two creation stories. You've got two stories of Abraham's covenant with God, two stories of him saying that his wife is his sister, two stories of just about everything. And, I always thought this is just a different view, but sometimes the stories contradict one another because they've traced them to basically the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel and of Judah. And in Judah, God was known as Yahweh in ancient Israelite religion. And in Israel, the northern kingdom, He was known as Elohim. And so you will also find in the duplication of the stories, one story will speak of Elohim and the next story will speak of Yahweh. Now, over time, they became identified with one another, and they came to refer to the same God. But if we look at their origins, they've got two distinct origins. Some might argue, well, it's not uncommon to God might have more than one name. But it also becomes obvious in terms of their interests. The Yahweh source always puts Judah in a favorable light and Israel in a not favorable light. They, the children, whenever the one tells stories about the other, it's not complementary at all. And there was also a competition between who's the true priesthood. Is it the Levites or is it the Aaronites? And so when the Levites tell stories about the Aaronites, they're the ones who said that Aaron made the golden calf. You will never read a story from the Aaronites' point of view that has got that story anywhere in it. They've got some other stories about the Levites. It's a bit shaky. So you've got these two sources. And so also with the creation story, we've got two creation stories. Genesis 1, from verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 5, in which God is referred to as Elohim. And the Elohim source always had a very elevated, transcendent view of God. In no Elohim source will you ever find talking animals or God coming down to converse with men or anything like that. That is not the Elohist view of God. The Yahweh source, they're much more creative. They've got talking animals. They've got God coming down with a few friends and chatting to Abraham. They've got all kinds of things. They're much more creative in the kind of description of their involvement with God. And it's very good because often the more transcendent stories just disappeared from history because people couldn't relate to that God. So the Yahweh source made it much more accessible. So when we get to the second story of creation, we'll see, if you read in the English Bible, it's just a different sequence. And you read the one day and the next one the following day, and you don't really compare them. If you put them next to one another, there's quite a few differences. For instance, in the first story, man is created last. In the second creation story, man is created first. And then God plants a garden, and then God sees that man's alone, so he makes animals to keep him company. And then he sees man is still alone, and he creates woman as the crown of creation. He's made it last. So the sequence is a bit different as well. But you see, these people weren't interested in the questions we ask of the text today. They weren't really concerned about exactly how God created in what sequence. They were communicating truths beyond historic factual situations. So when we move into the second creation story, it's beautiful how even in forming man and woman, another difference is created. And I don't have time to do that today, but I so wish I could put those stories in its literary context, to look at the other stories about who God is and how creation happened that was in the region when these stories were told, and how these stories gives a different vision of God. You can find that on our website. Let me just mention that now. It's called hearhim.net. You can go read more about it there. But in the second story, a creation account, you remember, the ladies taken from the side of Adam, and we translated that Rabe. It's very interesting that one of the translations, which was also very prevalent in some of the myths, is that man and woman in the beginning were fused back to back. And one part was man and one part was woman. And how God took a side of man to create woman. In other words, the woman is not a rib. The woman is one equal opposite side of man. Isn't that beautiful? That here God's starting to continue to create difference but likeness. You see, both are necessary for intimacy to happen. See, when our thoughts about God is, and it has often happened, even in the Elohim view of God's transcendent, we can put so much emphasis on his otherness that he becomes unreachable, unknowable. And that's what was often meant by his holiness. God is so utterly, completely separate from us that to even see him is to die. That's why Jacob is so surprised. I've seen the face of God, and yet I live. I mean, God is so different. And this is what happens when it's so much emphasis placed on his transcendence, he becomes unknowable, unapproachable. You just don't know what he's up to. He can make you and break you. He can, like the potter with the clay, he can do what is God beyond your wildest imagination. And so that emphasis brings people to a place of such insecurity of not knowing who he is, what he's going to do next. Jesus comes to surprise us with a God so much like us that we are shocked to see what God is really like. He's more like us than what we've ever imagined. But there remains something beautifully other about him. Why? Because there's no intimacy without otherness. There's no intimacy without distinction. The love flows between parties. It's a dynamic, relational quality, and therefore there will always be something beautifully, surprisingly, astonishingly other about God. But how is it that God can reveal himself and yet be other? It's because there's so much to be revealed that he will never exhaust the revelation of who he is. You see, the one important thing that we've realized about God in the person of Jesus is that God is love, and that means that whatever we don't know about him yet is no longer scary.
Yeah, good.
It's exciting. His otherness is a continual invitation for you to explore and discover dimensions about him and yourself that you haven't discovered yet. And so even the otherness of God becomes such an exciting prospect. On the other side, there's likeness. Now, this is universally an unnecessary warning, but sometimes we go around people where this is actually appropriate. We're around many different groups. I think there needs to come an understanding of God's likeness. I mean, Jesus comes to reveal to us that the true God is God with us, not God without us. The true God is God with us. In other words, the God that Colossians 1:17 says, in him all things consists. In other words, this God is not with you in your holy moments of prayer, meditation, or worship. This is the God who is with you in your deepest doubt, in your deepest alienation, in your greatest weakness, in your greatest torment. He is still the God with us. This is the God who has experienced everything you have experienced with you. Because in him, all things consists. And there comes a time where we become, it's a marvelous discovery to discover this God that we can so intimately relate with. That I can become aware that I don't even have to try and find this voice, try and find this direction. I remember one time I was praying for God's plan for my life, and I just heard suddenly, Andre, stop asking me for my plan for your life. And I was shocked because I thought that's a good thing to do. And I said, why? He said, your life is my plan. And I suddenly became aware of a God who comes to me disguised as my life. A God who comes to reveal himself to me, not in some holy moments here and there, but the God who's so immanent, present in the most ordinary events of life. It can be a Starbucks coffee. And the conversation that suddenly has eternal value. Jesus speaks about flowers and birds, and he suddenly shows how he's encountered a faith that makes God tangible in the most ordinary stuff of human life. So the warning that is universally almost unnecessary is that sometimes we discover the likeness of God to such an extent that we no longer see any distinction between ourselves and him. And when that happens, when there's no distinction, again, intimacy is gone. The highest form of love needs both the highest level of likeness and the highest level of otherness possible. It needs both a relational possibility which happens in likeness, and it needs the intrigue of otherness. And what God saw in you was exactly that, a being that would intrigue him for all eternity. And so likeness, otherness, God creates a difference between male and female. He takes one side of mankind. It's so beautiful in a male patriarchal society, how the vision of the Genesis writer is that this God creates man in his image and likeness, male and female, he created them. So for the first time, there's a God who is either just as much female as male, or he is neither male nor female in this vision. That we can't say he's just male or just female. Because male and female, he created them in his image and in his likeness. Then it says they were both naked and unashamed. That's going to become important as we go into Genesis 3, where I'm going to start showing how desire can just be slightly adjusted or twisted. But nakedness speaks about vulnerability. We know it about in the next verse where it says the snake was more arum. Arum is the Greek word for nakedness. We've translated the snake was more crafty, more cunning than any other animal, but it's the same word, nakedness. It actually says the snake was more naked. You know, the snake doesn't have arms to fight with or feet to kick with. It's more vulnerable than any of the other animals. We also see it where Joseph kind of accused his brothers and said, you are spies, you came to spy the nakedness of the land. The nakedness of the land was the place where it was more vulnerable to penetration from the enemy. And so that word nakedness speaks about the vulnerability. And so Adam and Eve were both naked but unashamed. Why are they unashamed? Their nakedness was never used as an opportunity to harm one another. Their nakedness might have been used for intimacy, for relationship, but it was never used for harm, and therefore there was no shame. And so the picture of the snake as well. We know when we speak about the snake today, we immediately conjure up pictures of this legendary Satan, and later writers did that. But when this piece was written, there was no concept at all of Satan as we understand it today. The snake in their culture and in the literature that was around at that time was reminiscent of some of the gods were represented. Normally the harmful gods were represented by wild beasts. The gods that were beneficial to us were represented by more cultivated animals like bulls or calves, those kind of things. And the gods that would harm us were wild beasts and sometimes snakes. And so in Babylon, where they were in exile, during which time these passages were written, there is a lot of understanding about the snake representing another god. And here the writer comes and says, no, the snake was one of the creatures God created. Okay, so there's no competition here. There's no other god in competition with him. I want to show you why the snake is such an apt symbol of what is going to happen in this passage of the temptation. The snake says to Eve, has God said you shouldn't eat the fruit of it? Because God suddenly, this is the other thing I want to show, God creates a new difference. He creates the difference between what is life-giving and what is death-producing. There is a tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Again, the ancient people in that context had an obsession with the tree of life. You can read it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story much older than any of the biblical stories we had. They were obsessed with trying to cheat the gods by which they could live eternally. Why? Because death was an in-your-face reality for them daily. If it wasn't disease, it was war. If it wasn't war, it was natural disasters. Death, the average age was, of life was less than 30 probably. So death is a real problem. Finding a way to cheat the gods, to live forever, brought the image of a tree of life, which was an obsession in many myths and cultures. Here the Genesis writer says he planted the tree of life, and everyone will think, oh, we know the story, it's the pursuit of the tree of life. But there was another tree also. They've never heard about that. See, he speaks a language that will get their attention to make them aware of something else. And then the rest of the story is about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the snake says, has God said you should not eat of it? Yes, we shouldn't eat, we shouldn't even touch it. I want to remember in Genesis 1:26, God creates man in his image, in his likeness. There's no competition, no rivalry. It's meant for intimacy. Desire reflects desire. Love reflects love. What's going to happen here, I want you to so clearly see, because it's got implications for every relationship you have. Because this beautiful relationship is going to be turned into a rivalry through just an adjustment of focus. And the snake says, God doesn't want you to eat from this tree because he doesn't want you to be like him. Now, what happens as a reflective being, a being that is wired to reflect the intentions and desires of others? When we perceive that God desires this tree more than any other tree, that is why he's withholding it for himself. What happens? We want that tree more than any other tree. Because first of all, we reflect the desire we perceive. Can you see how he slightly adjusted this desire? God's desire is no longer for you. God's desire is for this tree. And suddenly my desire is not for God, my desire is for this tree. And now we are competing for the same object. The moment we misinterpret the intentions of God as one who withholds, one who keeps back, one who enters into a place of rivalry with us, now a very different likeness is on offer. You see, the first place where God makes us in His image and likeness, it's an image and likeness that produces intimacy. But this likeness that is on offer in Genesis 3 is a likeness of rivalry. He wants this tree for himself. That's why you're not allowed to eat. And suddenly, if we both compete for the same object, competition begins. And competition unchecked leads to violence. And so let me put this in very human terms. What does this mean for our own being? You can imagine a room full of toys and the 3-year-old sitting amongst the toys and kind of not paying attention to any one of the toys, and another 3-year-old walks in. The first thing the new child will see is the other child. The second thing the child will see is the toy that is closest to the other child. He will head over to that toy, and the moment he reaches for it, the first child will realize that that is the toy he always wanted. And conflict erupts. And that's a summary of human history. That there's... And what happened? We are made to reflect one another. And when we lose sight of God, when we lose sight of the one who adores us, the one who loves us, we don't know what we want. Wow. And we start looking at one another to tell us what we want. Wow. And we start reflecting one another's confusion. Oh, you love that kind of car. I love that kind of car. Oh, you like that. I like that. And we don't even know where our desires come from. But there is not one desire that originates in you. You originate in the desires you reflect. And so that's why it's so important to once again see the God who desires you. And with that desire forms you. Let me give another example. We might get into it tonight. I don't know. Two young boys might meet one another at a tender age, let's say 6 years old, and they so enjoy one another's company because they've got the same kind of interest. We love fishing, we love the outdoors, we like playing with the catapult or whatever, and they might not realize it. They might think we're just lucky to find a friend that is so much like myself. What they don't realize is they have mutually reinforced one another's desires through their lives, and they have picked up on what they really like from one. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way in which we were designed to enter into meaningful relationship and friendship, is by reflecting, by imitating, and by cultivating one another's desires. It's the way it should be. And they grow up and they go to college, and you can imagine if they suddenly see the same girl. They might not even notice it. They might have unconsciously noticed the glance of a friend who communicated to them what is desirable. And both fall in love with the same girl. The very quality that made them best of friends can make them worst of enemies. So can you see how the snake is such a perfect metaphor for twisted, mimetic desire? that it is just an adjustment of desire where the very thing that has cultivated intimacy now cultivates competition and rivalry. And if rivalry goes unchecked, it leads to all kinds of evils. I wonder if I should go into that. Maybe tonight. but let me give a beginning. And I must say, for this, I am, and many other people are really indebted to a French intellectual called René Girard, who developed what is known as mimetic theory. And that is basically looking at the origins of human society and civilizations from the point of view that we are reflective beings. And I think what we're going to do is I'm going to show you in the next session how this reflective capability led to the practice of sacrifice, and how sacrifice was the birth of religion, and how all of that has its origin in a perverted reflection of misinterpreted intentions because we lost sight of the God who adores us. And then in the light of that, we're going to look at the sacrifice of Jesus, which is called the last sacrifice. Because what is the perfect sacrifice for a God who says, your sacrifices and offerings I do not desire? It's the sacrifice that forever nullifies our sacrificial systems. So we're gonna have a look at that. Wonder, what shall I leave you with this? I know. This is just a little poem that reflects upon how desire forms us, and it's such a beautiful picture, you know, when God spoke over this chaos and brought order through His word, brought such meaning. Desire found me, whispered into my formless confusion, formed me, gave these scattered thoughts direction. This desire is mine, I thought. I made it. I brought it forth. All the while, I was my desire's form. I am not my own song. To desire I belong. Empty intentions you did fill. My heart with passion you caused to spill. Loved your life into me. Over this chaotic being you blew, gently nourished me like morning dew. I love because you first loved me. I desire for you first desired me. I exist because you wanted me in your midst. It's such a beautiful place to discover our origin in a God who desires us. And God's desire for you is not the desire of a third party who wants to manipulate and control you. He's got no interest in just limiting you and giving you a narrow little path in which He wants to modify your behavior and make you the kind of person that pleases Him. God has got one desire, and that is to set you free, to be fully and truly yourself, the real self, because the self that He made is His image and likeness, and God has got no suspicion towards His own image and likeness. That real self, that whole self. You see, this is the beautiful place where you see an intermingling between yourself and God, where there's a part of me that only exists in the otherness of God, and there's a part of God that exists in me. It's such a beautiful picture of the Trinity, where they fully partake of one another's beings, yet they remain distinctly themselves. It's a love between that's a dynamic flow. But in this dynamic flow, why are you here? Because God wanted to extend his love beyond a love of likeness to likeness. He wanted to extend his love beyond himself to another. A love that is so boundless that he can even say, love your enemies. And this is the way in which God annihilates his enemies. He makes them friends.
Oh, good.
He makes them friends. And so it is in this place that we discover that there's a I am not a little round circle that exists in isolation. We are part of a story. That is huge. We are intertwined into the most beautiful love story ever told. And I think what we're going to do in the next session is to look at how that redefines our past, present, and future.
Yay.
How God comes to offer you an alternative memory. Exciting stuff. Mary Ann, do you want to end off with a few songs?
You are so beautiful. You're so valuable to me. Righteous, you're blameless and innocent.